My name's Kermit and I'm an addict.
Hi, Kermit.
Will it reach here? Is that good?
Huh?
Will the tape hear me from here? There's a nod. Let's open this meeting with a moment of silence for the addict who still suffers in and out of this room, and we'll follow that with the we version of the Serenity Prayer for those who care to join. Thanks. Serenity Prayer. God, grant us serenity to accept things we cannot change, the courage to change the things that we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Welcome everybody to the first annual, that's what we decided, first annual Acorn Hill History Retreat and something. It's a beautiful afternoon out on a sunny day on the field, and in the spirit of our friend Greg Pierce, we wanted to do something that was annual, memorial, and that would continue the process of teaching the history of Narcotics Anonymous, which is something that he held deep in his heart, and he did selflessly for 28 years in Narcotics Anonymous. I haven't done this talk in a little while, and I did absolutely no preparing, so we're shooting straight from the hip, but I have done it several times. So the first thing that I usually like to talk about is, since this is a 12-step program that was based on the 12 steps borrowed and adapted from Alcoholics Anonymous, is to start with a talk about how AA's 12 steps happened, and then we'll quickly go into Narcotics Anonymous history. Bill Wilson, as I was told, woke up out of a dream one night and wrote down the 12 steps. The 12 steps that he wrote down are different in some regards as to ones that we have today, and that was because the way their big book was written, Bill Wilson wrote a rough draft of that big book, and this is a copy of that manuscript, the original manuscript, and they sent it to the Akron group, which Group Conscience did, the AA Akron group. They sent it to the New York group that did more Group Conscience. They sent it back to Bill with notes. He did rewrites, and it went through that process several times before it was approved, and it was approved by 100 recovering alcoholics who had been sober for 1 year. In Bill's, some of the neat things in his 12 steps was, it said, where was the one we were talking about earlier? We're entirely willing to that God remove all these defects of character. Humbly on our knees, asked Him to remove our shortcomings, holding nothing back. Like that. And the one I like the most, of course, is the 12th one, which is, having had a spiritual experience as a result of this course of action, we tried to carry this message to others, especially alcoholics, and to practice these principles in all our affairs. See, my belief in there is that Bill Wilson understood that when you have a spiritual awakening, you'd be of service to anybody. You know? And the 100 alcoholics decided in their group conscience to streamline it to primary purpose and changed it to carry the message to the alcoholic. So today we have carry the message to the addict. And if you look back at a lot of the 12-step movements, or 6-step movements, or things that AA was born out of, the Oxford group, they were into a lot of proselytizing and a lot of saving and a lot of religious stuff, and they were trying to do everything for everybody. And I think it was the singleness of purpose that kept AA going and kept it so, and made it so successful. And therefore, when it came to us and we adapted it for our own means, we had a pretty sure proven method to carry a message that worked. The first inklings of something called Narcotics Anonymous, or 12 steps for addicts, came through the narcotic addiction program in Lexington, Kentucky. In the 1940s, if you wanted to get drug treatment, there was only one place in America, and that was in through the federal penitentiary system in Lexington, Kentucky. So, of course, basically you had to be a jailbird to get in there anyways. And these were kind of farm-type places. And there was a guy in Montgomery, Alabama named Houston Sewell who was in AA, and he was trying to help a buddy of his get off morphine using the 12 steps. He thought this was a good idea. Houston moved up to Lexington, and when he got there, he got in touch with this guy named Dr. Vogel, who was the director of the Lexington Drug Treatment Program, and suggested this idea about addicts using the 12 steps and adapting them to get clean. And he did this, and they started some meetings that they called, I believe, Addict Anonymous in the Lexington program. And for a lot of meetings of NA, somewhere, a lot of them could get traced back into this program because people from different parts of the country were going into Lexington and then going back home with some seed of an idea that there was hope for addicts and that there was some 12-step program that could be utilized. During the periods in the late 40s, there was a guy named Danny Carlson from New York, and he went through 8 or 9 times, a good addict like most of us, and kept relapsing, and he kept going back. Well, on his 9th time, he ended up surrendering, and he went back to New York City to a fledgling group called Narcotics Anonymous. And they had meetings going in New York City in the late 1949, 1950, 51. One of the problems, there were several problems with this group, one of them was that the traditions in AA hadn't been written until 53. So there were no traditions to go by. The other problem, of course, is your standard problem of powerful personalities. There was also the problem of outside people helping to run NA, and what happened with that. They had a meeting at a YMCA in Midtown, and they had started H&I meetings in Rikers Island in the Tombs, and they were bringing NA meetings in there. Danny had a sidekick, a woman named Ray Lopez. I guess you call her sponsee today. When Danny passed, he passed from natural causes, addiction, burning him out. Ray took over NA. Ray got an office, she got a job working for the city narcotics division. And her office was, half the office was the narcotics division and the other half was Narcotics Anonymous. So they set up a board of directors for this Narcotics Anonymous, and it was with Father Dan Egan and Major Barry, who was from the Salvation Army, and she moved out to California and later played a large role in helping addicts in the early NA meetings out there. And they had made a decision that no addicts could be on this board. So it was only non-addict kind of trustee things. In the late, around the same time in California, there were people trying to get something going. They opened up a second federal drug treatment center in Houston, Texas, and they were using this same AA-NA model there. And there were people getting out of there, and they were, being sent there from California and other places, and were coming back. They were starting meetings out there they called HFD meetings, which is habit-forming drugs. Most every meeting out there at that time was an underground meeting because, back then in the 40s, early 50s, if you had tracks, you went to jail. If you were an addict, you went to jail. So everything was, hush-hush and secret. A group of these people had been talking about trying to do something different, and one of those people was Jimmy Kennan, who we consider our founder. He's one of the original people to start NA, and he's the guy who stuck it out all the way through. This group of people got together, and they even cut some minutes for this first business meeting, and these are a copy of the actual minutes. They're handwritten, and they talk about August 17th, 1953. A committee of 6, including, and they have a list of people, met at an address to form something that they wanted to call Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, AA-NA. And at the very first meeting, they elected Jimmy the chairperson, and he told them that their idea of calling it AA-NA was out of order, that it wouldn't fly, that they couldn't, they wouldn't be given permission for that. And he was voted out of order himself. He thought he had the dubious distinction of being voted out of order in the first business meeting of NA, and he turned out later to be right because they wrote to AA World Services, and it says in about the 4th or 5th meeting that after writing to AA World Services that they chose to rename the group from San Fernando Valley AANA to Narcotics Anonymous. They met a couple more times, and they set up their first meeting at the Salvation Army Dads Club, Sun Valley, California, behind the Sun Lumber Company, and they started NA. They had, in their bylaws, they made a commitment that they would meet every Wednesday night for 1 year, agreeing that one recovery would be significant. And if you think about the several 100,000 members we have in Narcotics Anonymous today, they got a lot more than one recovering person, because they were dedicated. So what happened? The typical thing happened. You had powerful personalities. There wasn't really any traditions. There was one guy, Cy Mallow, who was a real powerhouse, and he decided he was going to make money on this stuff, and he would go to places and give Narcotics Anonymous talks. And in fact, at the office, they received a phone call from one place that said, "Where do you want your $100 check?" And they said, "What do you mean $100 check?" He said, "Well, we had this guy, Sal, came and gave a talk, and we were supposed to pay him for it." They said, "Never mind." NA had boiled down to one meeting. It was at a place called the Schreier's Dryer. And it was the Schreier's Alcoholic Detox Center, a dry-out center, so they called it the Schreier's Dryer. And they had what they called a show of hands meeting, which I thought was, you raise your hand and somebody picks on you. Well, I later found out what a show of hands meeting was they asked how many alcoholics are in the room and how many addicts are in the room. If they had more alcoholics, they had an AA meeting. If they had more addicts, they had an NA meeting. What happened was, towards the end of '59, a young woman went in there looking for the meeting, and there was no meeting. There was a little bit of a collection left. There was no literature left. There was nobody doing anything. Everybody had been driven off by the powerful personalities. And she went to Jimmy and said, "What do we do?" And Jimmy, in his inimitable style, said, "Well, we're going to get a cup of coffee, and then we're going to start over again." And they agreed to start over again and to follow the traditions, which had now been written. The meetings they got started, I believe, I not being back there, I mean, it's all guesswork. I've read a lot of stuff and a lot of history books on it. There was a meeting at Moore Park. There was a couple. I think it got up to like 2 or 3 meetings. Well, actually, there was one meeting when this guy Bob Barrett, who I don't know, most of you know, his wife found the meeting. He said, "I had a real good caretaker wife." She happened to find the only NA meeting in the whole world, and he sent her there to check it out. And she said the coast was clear, and he came, and he relapsed a bunch of times, and he ended up going back to prison. And when he'd go back to prison, the NA people would go visit him and see him and talk with him, and he finally got out and surrendered, and he became one of those dedicated workers in NA. The fellowship started to grow. There was a few publications that came out very early on. You know the date on this one? This is a copy of the first white book. We had a history convention in Alabama about 10 years ago, and Greg took out his copy and made these little copies. So this is an exact copy of the very first white book that was ever made, and it's like 6 pages or so. And it's got a Just for Today on the back, and it's got P.O. Box 1043, Studio City, California. And then there's another box in San Diego. So there was 2 different things. Now that was another interesting thing that went on in the early 70s. There was a north-south split in the fellowship. Some people had gone, some of the starting members had gone from Southern California up to San Francisco and had opened up a treatment center up there. It's like a street clinic kind of thing, and based it on the Narcotics Anonymous model. It was the first real kind of NA type treatment. and addicts were getting clean through there, and there was a burgeoning of the fellowship up in that part of the country. There was a kind of war that broke out between the North and South, and the groups, some of the groups said, well, you know, we got as much NA meetings as you do. Why are you the World Service Office? We can be the World Service Office. We print our own literature. So they started printing literature up there. They got a bright idea. They took a pamphlet called This is AA, and they reworded it and changed the words to NA and produced something called This is NA. And it's got a San Diego, I think, I'm trying to think of what the address is on it, but I have it here somewhere. You know, good conscience and God prevailed, and things kind of settled back down. In the early 70s, when our sponsor came around, he said there was about 10 NA meetings in the world in California, all the same place pretty much. And as he got active, he became very close with Jimmy Kennan, and they participated in doing a lot of creating of things in NA. Oh, NEM. We're getting a rather breezy, blustery day. It was in the 70s that Greg wrote something called the NA tree. There was no service structure to connect NA groups. NA groups basically contacted the World Service Office, which had flip-flopped in and out of different places. It was in a the phone line was used at a crisis center for a while, and that didn't work. It kept ending up back at Jimmy K's house, Greg P. had decided that there needed to be some kind of structure to connect all these NA groups. There were little groups that sprang up in different places, and they were pretty much isolated. And he wrote a service structure called the tree, and that connected all the different groups. And one of the neatest things, I guess, for him was to be able to sit down in the first ever area service meeting, which was held in California, and to actually see what he saw on paper become a reality. To be able to see this thing happen and know that it can connect everybody and that it can work. They connected and talked to the people in Pennsylvania. There was a pretty strong group in Harrisburg and Philadelphia, and they decided right away that this was the way to go, and they took over this model, and the service structure grew out of that and has changed since then. Narcotics Anonymous seems to be about bright shining stars, and that God brings people in at different times that have different talents and different abilities right when they're needed. In the late 79, I believe it was 79 or so, there was people in Atlanta, Georgia that were recovering they had meetings going for at least 5 years, and there was a guy named Bo from Atlanta that probably everybody knows, they had a lot of discussions about an NA book there, and you know, who's writing our book, when's the book going to be produced, and he got sent out to California to the World Convention to see who's writing our book. And when he got out there, he started walking around talking to people, and he was getting led from person to person, you know, because people said, well, I don't know, why don't you talk to Jack? And then they'd go to Jack, and he'd say, well, I don't know, why don't you talk to Jimmy? And the only person that was really trying to gather literature together in some form was, and had been so for a while, was Greg. And he was, at that time, I believe, president of the Parent Service Corporation or something, which was like one of the first kind of World Service Office boards. And, you know, Greg had this lovely line that he would tell people when they asked about a book. He would say, you're the book, write it down. And when Bo got to him, and said, who's writing our book? Greg said to him, you're the book, write it down. And of course Bo said, well, I've got a bunch of pages upstairs in my room. You know, what a friend of mine said when I was giving a talk in Missouri on history, he said, this is not necessarily NA, it's as Kermit sees it, or as Kermit thought he saw it. So what happened was some magical stuff started happening. Bo had thought, this guy's going to talk to me for a minute or two, and then he's going to leave. He said, well, they started walking down a hall. He said when he turned right, Greg followed him and turned right. When he turned left, Greg walked with him. And it was surprising to him, and they ended up spending a lot of time talking that weekend, and Bo stuck around for a couple days and went to the house and met Lois, and they started talking about some real stuff about getting this book going. And Bo Bo flew back to Atlanta, and about 6 months later he sent Greg a postcard, and it was just a plain old postcard, but the underlying hidden meaning behind it was so special. It said, send my love to Lois and the kids, Merry Christmas, and guess who bought a typewriter? And that typewriter, had been started pounding that day, and I don't think it's ever stopped. It's just changed into a computer, and it's still pounding away. Greg said, why don't you send out letters to the fellowship about the book? And he said, well, I can't do that. I'm not anybody. And Greg informed him that he was on the Board of Trustees Literature Committee, which I think consisted of him and Greg at the time. And so he wrote a letter, and sent it out to the fellowship.
They had somebody else.
Oh, yeah. So we have another culprit here in our midst. Lois would type things and Bo and Greg would sign them. Right? So they had a World Service Conference, and Bo came out and he was elected World Literature Chair. And they were mandated to write a basic text of Narcotics Anonymous. They decided that they would have lit conferences where people could come for like a week and sit and participate, and that any member who wanted to participate could show up and join in. And the first one they had, I'm not sure, was that Wichita or not? But at the first conference, they didn't even know where to start, but they decided that they had a little white book, and there was little chapters in there, who, what, how, why, and all that, and that they would use those as chapter headings for the basic text. And then they decided, in a stroke of genius, that they would cut up all the literature input that they had. They'd make Xerox copies, and they cut it into paragraphs and thoughts and ideas. And they would take all these paragraphs, thoughts, and ideas, and they would put them down under the topic heading that it fit. If it had to do with why are we here, it would go in that pile. If it had to do with recovery and relapse, it would go in that pile. And then they had these piles of little cutouts, and they would go through them, and then they would put them together in some kind of order and do some writing in between to make it flow together. So the basic text of Narcotics Anonymous is basically a cut and paste job. But the miracle is that when you read it, it touches you in your heart. The other thing that they did when they were writing this book was that they prayed. They prayed before they started any of their projects. And they asked God to relieve them of the bondage of self and to make them servants of His will and not theirs, so that no addict seeking recovery need die from the horrors of addiction without having had a chance to find a new way of life. And, I think it was through that spiritual process that some amazing things happened. They didn't have enough money to keep working at one point, and an addict from out west named Jim, he was a biker, he sold his motorcycle to raise money. And a bunch of the members went down and they gave blood. They sold their blood so that they would have enough money for copying machines and the stuff that they needed to do the work they needed. If you're interested in that prayer, it's at the beginning of the basic text in here. They call it the service prayer or the literature prayer. They got all this stuff together into a rough form in Memphis. They were missing one portion, which was the traditions portion, and Greg had agreed to write that portion. And it was also agreed that it would be turned over to the trustees to group conscience. Greg wasn't there. He was in Oregon at the time, and they were in Memphis, and they wanted it bad. And they were going to fly him in, and they decided, well, the hell with that, we can't even wait. So they decided that they would have it transcribed over the telephone. And they got this girl who typed really fast, and she sat down, and Bo stood behind her and held the phone to her ear. And Greg read the traditions that he'd worked on, and he edited them in his mind and read them out loud. And Lois is going, yep, I was there. And started reading, and this woman started typing. And Bo said he was standing there watching the traditions pour off the page, one after another. And she typed, and Bo held the phone, and he got tired after a while. And, he got tired, and somebody put a chair under his butt, and he sat down, and he thought he'd been there for about an hour and a half, maybe, while this woman typed and Greg talked. And when they finished, they looked at their watch, and they'd been there like 6 hours typing this stuff out.
All night.
All night. And the amazing thing is that, the genius of Greg Pierce was that when they gave those traditions as they were typed out to the Board of Trustees, to Group Conscience, the Board of Trustees said they're perfect, and they didn't make a single change. They gave them back the way it was. They put this stuff all together in Memphis, and they came out with a gray book, and that's what this is. This is the first rough draft of the basic text of Narcotics Anonymous. And I believe, they had like 900 addresses, and they sent them out to any address they could find. They had this guy, Roger from New York, do a search around the world, and Roger would call cities and ask for treatment centers and get AA numbers, and he'd call them and ask them if they had any address for NA or any contact for NA, and whatever they could find, they would send them out. They sent one to Australia to a treatment center, and one of the guys that picked it up is still clean today, and he was a board trustee member for years, Garth. There was another one, a girl from Ireland, that went to the NA post office box there and found the gray book there.
They sent one to India.
And they sent one to India, right? And what it was asked was, when you got this, it was written in line numbered. Each page had a top number of the page, and down the side there was numbers all the way to the bottom, so that you could say, like on page 10, line 27, change from this to that. So it was a really brilliant way to do, review literature. And people reviewed this, and they sent it all back in, and they came out with what's called the white approval form of the basic text. We call it a white floppy. I got one. This is basically what it looks like without the newly revised. I gotta find my white floppy. It had a slick cover. We called it a white floppy. And this was the first thing that I ever saw that was bigger than a white book. And I thought, wow, this is cool. And I made 40 copies immediately. And we gave them out to everybody. Little did I know there was people all over the country doing the same thing. There was some people up in Michigan and Ohio that were doing 400 copies at a time, And they got a cease and desist letter from the office because, of course, they were printing, copyrighted material. And they decided, well, we got to do one more batch. They did one more batch of 400, took the top copy, wrote on it, "Recovery can't wait," and they sent it to the office. The fellowship at the World Service Conference voted to approve what was in here. There was also a second half, which was the stories. They came in a little folder, a little mailer like this, and this is what was sent out. This was all the stories that they had copyrights for, because they had a bunch more stories, but they couldn't track the people down to get a copyright release for them. I believe Bo said that all the things that were in here went in the book. I'm not sure. And this was voted at the World Service Conference, and it was approved as our basic text of Narcotics Anonymous. The idea was to, this is where some more fun starts. They had hired a printer and gave him a bunch of money, and the guy ended up running out with the money. Good addict story. One of the girls that worked for the guy, who had left and gone to another company, promised that she could get the job done, and they went ahead and decided that they needed some cash, and they were going to come out with, first, a red limited edition for $25. That poor red limited. And the money was going to go to help, produce more basic texts. And this is a first red limited edition. of Narcotics Anonymous. Each book on the second page, if you open it up, it says NA First Edition. There's a line there and the place where they wrote the numbers in. And somebody reinformed me last night. There's 5,000 of those made and sold. There was 2 copies that there was no number put in, and one was given to Greg and one was given to Jimmy K. A problem happened between the approval of our basic text and the creation of this red limited edition. Jimmy K, being the office manager at the time, saw a couple of lines in the traditions that he felt was not appropriate and not in the spirit of the traditions or NA. And what it was 2 different lines and 2 different traditions. One of them said, what about our service boards, our committees? Are these things NA? And what the fellowship approved in that white floppy was, no, these are not NA. These are services that a group may or may not choose to utilize. Now, if you think of that on a spiritual plane, it removes service and the ego of service, this is my opinion, and puts it on a separate level. NA's here. You guys, this is fun and everything else, but it's not NA. NA is what happens on Friday night and the group that runs it. Everything else is not NA. It's services a group may or may not choose to utilize. Jimmy thought that was inappropriate and wanted it taken out. The other line was later on, it said, service boards and committees cannot decide, rule, dictate, or censor. Well, a service board and committee decided, ruled, and dictated to censor those parts and took those 2 lines out. What happened was Jimmy got together, did a group conscience call between the Board of Trustees chair, the Board of Directors chair, all the chairs of the major bodies, the conference chair, and they in total voted yes to change them. They made the changes and then produced the book. There was a big hue and cry, especially on the East Coast, for people who had spent, years arguing over every single syllable and line that went in that book, and that somebody would go in like that and make a change against group conscience. They went out to California. There was some people lost their jobs in the Board of Trustees. And there was motions to return the basic text to its original form. They had since come out with, first edition and the second edition. They had changed it back in the printing. So there's a first edition, there's a second edition. There's a second edition paste up where they actually pasted those little lines back in there that were taken out. And then there was a motion to change the basic text back to its original form. Well, of course, the people who voted on it, and this is all my understanding, and if somebody was there, they can correct me, but most of the people I knew, their idea was the original form was this white floppy, and what was said, tradition, service boards and committees cannot decide, rule, dictate, and censor, and these things are not NA. That's what we voted on, saying, put it back to that. That's the original form. When it got to the conference, it was decided that the original form was the red book that was produced without those lines in it. Motion passed, the red book remained the same, those lines were taken out, and there was never enough rallying cry or desire or whatever to get them put back in, so they've been removed. This later came up in the Purist movement and the radical outbreak of what is fondly referred to as the baby blues. I might as well talk about that and then kind of wrap up. The 1985, we all went to Washington, D.C. It was like probably late 84. They were doing a fundraiser because they had a bid for the World Convention, and they wanted the World Convention to come to D.C. They didn't have enough money, so they did like a mini convention where people would come and spend some money and sell some t-shirts, and that money would be used for their World Convention bid. We had my friends and I had a bid for Virginia Beach, very spiritual, bring the world to the beach. There were some people from Pennsylvania, there were some people from all over the East Coast, and we all, in the spirit of NA, you're fighting against somebody else, but you go help them, so we all showed up at their fundraiser, which really moved them because a lot of people from D.C. didn't come. The convention was right in their hometown. And we all showed up at this convention. And Saturday night, about 11 o'clock, we were all sitting up in a room. And we started talking about the Purists. There was an article in the NA Way magazine, most of which of the articles had been written by a guy named Jim Miller from Ohio. And he was filling this up with some... one of the pieces that he wrote about was, what about these so-called purists, these people who only go to NA, they identify themselves as addicts, and they find their recovery just in NA. Are these people radicals? And the article said, no, they're purists. And we talked about that, and we decided, the Virginia group, we had a big circle t-shirt. It was a picture of the world, and it said, bring the world to the beach. And we decided to make a logo with that same circle and world and say purist on it. And, you know, we all kind of giggled about it and made a long list about, you know, the attributes of a purist. And it was like, you know, 30 items long. You know, you had to be God to fulfill this. But we all laughed. And then they had the World Convention. And that was in September. In June, at the 6th East Coast Convention, this little guy named Jimmy D from Trenton showed up with a little duffel bag with these little purple t-shirts that had that purist emblem on them that we had designed, and we just fell in love with it. And he had this little white two-piece little thing called the Purist Newsletter. And, you know, he handed them out to a few of us in the inner circle, and we just took them and went crazy, and we made hundreds of copies and sent them everywhere. I went over to England for the second European Service Conference in London, and I put a stack of them on the table kind of surreptitiously and then ran away, and being the chicken shit that I was. And they ended up having a meeting about it, you know, the committee that was running the conference, and they asked me if I would come speak about it, and I said no, and so they took them off the table. And about 6 months later, I was at the World Service Conference, and I got called into a panel. I mean, there was a table that was like 20 people from World Services, quote them, and Bob Stone, and he wanted to discuss with me something. He didn't say what, and he started talking in a rambling kind of way about, you know, that I'm the center of this thing, and we get all the information here at the World Service. He said, and we want to know about this pamphlet, and he slapped it down in front of me, and this organization that you have, and this, you know, and I said, Bob, it was just something cool, and I made a bunch of copies and left them in England. You know, so you know, that was the 80s. You know, there was a very big us and them kind of thing, and there was a lot of battles behind all that stuff. Most of them centering on the word group, centering on the word trusted servant, and the decision on where you want to put the emphasis. Because the people that I was brought up under, they taught me that we have trusted servants. We elect people to serve us, and we trust you to serve, and if you're not serving, we're going to get you out, and we'll put somebody else in there who will. We're intelligent enough to make the decisions. We just want you to bring us the information in a, you know, honest, up, forthright way, and then we'll have a true group conscience. And that group conscience is the end product. That's the decision-making body. The rest of it goes. The other half of NA believes that you have trusted servants, which means we elect you with care and we trust you to serve. Now go do the job. Right, don't bother us because we're going to go recover. And we always have the ultimate authority of yanking you. Well, some friends of mine, this lovely guy Larry North, who we call the old man, had many, many years, and he was a feisty Irishman, decided that the ultimate authority was the purse string. That's the ultimate authority, the money. Hit them where the money is, okay? And where was the money coming that was funding the people that had a different viewpoint was the sales of the basic text of Narcotics Anonymous. So Larry and Grateful Dave and a couple other people splintered off in a group and made something they called Baby Blues, which were basically a reprint of the basic text, 3rd edition, revised, newly revised with some more revision. And they went back in and put those two traditions back in there. What they really were doing was trying to send a message to the office, a couple of messages. One of them was that why is the basic text so expensive when we could make a book like this that costs about 39 cents to make, and every addict who walks in the door could have one for free. We wouldn't have to spend money. The other half of that story is that the money that's made on the basic text goes to provide an awful lot of services that we don't see. Reaching out to different countries, having World Service Conferences, and a lot of other things that are just, that keep NA growing, and, in a big growing fellowship, it's going to need money to run that business. The budget for the office is like $1 million or something like that, where it is today. And the other, of course, strongest message was, we don't like what you're doing, you can't have any more money. We're going to take the money away. this finally boiled down to a lawsuit between the World Service Office and one gentleman, Grateful Dave, and he went to court with them in Pennsylvania. It was real interesting what happened there, because they both sides talked about it and agreed that they would go with what the judge says. You know, the judge said, you know, Dave, will you stop producing these things if you go with what the, you know, and they said fine. And, you know, basically the judge said to them, what are you guys doing here? You know, you're about saving people's lives. What are you doing sitting here in a courtroom playing games, you know? But when they did, the judge said, he ruled that the conference should put on its agenda, if they had the time, to have a motion that every NA group in the world vote on which basic text they wanted. Not all the GSRs go to the ASRs, go to the region and all that, but each individual group gets to vote, and that group goes into one big pile, and that's the motion, whatever, how many pros and cons, period. They agreed to that. Now the key word in there was, if they had the time. Well, they just managed to never have the time to put that motion into the conference agenda report. So it passed away, and so did Grateful Dave. He died of AIDS, and a lot of the light out of that whole movement got taken out. Larry passed away from emphysema. You know, a lot of it, the rallying cry about the purist movement was that we had all started betting our lives on NA, and at the time, NA as we know it, it didn't exist. NA was that other place where you went to enhance your AA recovery. You went to AA, and then every now and then you'd go to these NA meetings where you could talk about drugs. When some of us started betting our lives on NA, we wanted an NA that we could recover in. And because we felt it was, you know, we had nowhere else to go, we had committed ourselves, we were willing to fight for this. You know? And we also had a lot of fear that this wouldn't survive and we'd have nowhere to go. So of course there was a lot of hostility underneath that. As time passed and NA meetings grew and, you know, recovery grew and, you know, we grew, you know, most of us started working steps and, you know, the need for that hardcore, you know, stand up in your face stuff, you know, has died away. NA's doing just fine, right? In spite of us. Right? On the table up here we have literature from different countries, some really neat stuff. On the table there's a lot of different material from different countries. I went to Greece for the Greek convention. It was their 4th convention, but at that convention they were passing out something called the Basic Text of Narcotics Anonymous in Greek. It was really neat because I ran around the convention and I asked everybody to sign it because I knew that this would be the first people to get clean on a basic text, you know. You can pass around if you want to look at it. It's truly amazing to go to NA in another country where it's a different language. And one of the neatest things that happened to me in Greece was I sat in a regular NA meeting. It was a regular Wednesday night or Thursday night meeting of Narcotics Anonymous, and they don't have all the literature in Greek. So they had people who were bilingual would open up the Just for Today and read it to themselves in English and translate it into Greek. I mean, I went on a Sunday night to an 11-step meeting where they were reading out of It Works How and Why, and the people were reading it and translating it into Greek so that everybody could have an 11-step meeting. I was just in tears just watching this stuff. It moved me so much to see what these people are willing to do to get the message. And we just sit in the meeting and, you know, open the book and don't realize, you know, half of what's going on. I went to Istanbul, Turkey, and this is a rough draft of their basic text. It's in Turkish, right? That may be Greek to you. Greek. We have little white books here from Israel. Some of the neat stuff in international was that the first NA meetings, there was NA meetings held in Germany in late 70s, and they came through the military, the U.S. military being over there. They started meetings over there. Well, in England, they had a bunch of addicts were getting clean in AA, and there was this old Irishman there who didn't like it. He wanted his AA pure. He didn't like it, right? So he got in touch with this guy over in Germany and got a starter kit from them for NA. Found a place in the church in London, downtown London. Paid the rent for a month. Grabbed a couple of NA people, addict alcoholics that were in his meeting, and said, "Here's a starter kit. Here's a meeting. The rent's paid for a month. Now go get out of here." And that's how NA in England got started. By about 2 years later, there was 90 meetings a week in London. And about 5 years after that, they had 6 years after that, they hosted the World Convention in London, England. So, NA, you know, you don't have to have more members. Just a member with a resentment and a coffee pot will start a new meeting anywhere in the world. The stuff up here, you know, feel free to come up and take a look at it. The only other piece of literature that I didn't talk about, which I'll go real quickly because Scott and I were chatting about something earlier, was It Works, How and Why. The fellowship voted to have a step book, like 12 and 12, we came up. There was a purple review draft that was made, and between the review draft and the approval form, the literature committee decided, in their infinite wisdom, that they would hire a professional writer, because in their guidelines it says, you know, our service centers may employ special workers, things like that, and they felt that the basic text was jumbled. You know, it was like cut and paste, which, yeah, well, that's why, because it was. And they decided that if they have one person take all the input and put it in form, it would read well and clear and concise and consistent all the way through. Now, Bob Stone, the manager of the World Service Office, had just spent about $10,000 on a video for NA, a public information video, and it was a big success. They hadn't asked anybody's permission. The committee had come to him, and you know, under the guidelines that he had, our service centers may employ special workers. They spent the money and did the job, and it was a big success. When the literature committee came to him with the idea of hiring a worker, he went out and searched and found somebody, and found this guy Jess Laird, who wrote "I Ain't a Wonder," "I Ain't Much Baby, But I'm All I've Got," and, you know, a couple of different books. Jess had had cancer, and he had used the 12 steps to deal with it, and had written these books. He took the job on, and he got overloaded at the time, and he suggested his wife, who was a writer named Jessica. She had 10 years in AA, and it was agreed to let her finish the project. Jessica actually even went around the country talking to old-timers and taping their stories and their versions of the steps and the traditions to incorporate all of this into all the input that we had. What she came out with was this book, the white approval form of It Works, How and Why, which my wife and I and Larry kindly referred to as It Sucks, We and Them. What happened was that, first off, is she was listening to people's individual stories, and she started writing in an individual manner, which is not appropriate for NA literature. You know, in the first step, you know, where we're powerless over our addiction, she has on the first page the word drugs 9 times, which tells me that her concept of addiction was not what our concept was. Her concept was an A model of powerless over drugs, and it comes across throughout the book. The rest of it is the writing wasn't really good. She talks about being whipped. Said, finally we had to admit that this thing had whipped us, that we shouldn't get back in the ring. We got whipped. We were really whipped. The lady was whipped 4 times. She talked about in the second step, in the first step, it said sharks were chasing us down the street. This was one individual member's, you know, hallucinations, but she put it in as part of our first step. Our addiction was using drugs and the whole way of thinking and acting and looking at the world. Step 2, this is a good one. Step 2, we came to believe the power greater selves that could restore us from sanity. The first page, she says, we have done some crazy things. Probably one of the craziest things. It was crazy. It wasn't the crazy things that we did. The really crazy thing. This was all on page. And yeah, I can go on and on and on. One of the things was, I think it was step 3, is why do we have to do such a hard step so early on? And to a lot of us, step 3 was not a hard thing. It was a wonderful thing. what happened was that the people who invested a lot of money in this book and a lot of energy touting the money they had invested were really ready to get it on the tables. It had been several years in the making, and there was a quarterly conference in Charlotte, North Carolina, World Service Quarterly Conference, and Larry and my wife and I and Dave went down to this conference to point out some of our problems with our book. We got down there, and the World Lit chair, the Board of Trustee chair was Jack Bernstein at the time, met Dave in the hallway, and he said, "Are you the spokesman for this group?" And he said, "Well, it's not really a group, it's just people are concerned." And he said, "Well, I'll tell you what, we'll meet you at 8 o'clock tonight, myself and the World Lit chair, and we'll hear what you have to say." And that was really nice. Larry and I made up signs, and we put them all over the walls in the whole conference center, letting people know there was going to be a meeting on It Works How and Why. I thought, and Larry thought, that, you know, there'd be like 2 or 3 world people to listen to us bitch, and that would be the end of it. And the amazing spiritual thing was that when we got in the room, every world level trusted servant had showed up, and they all wanted to hear what we had to say. There was like 30 people in the whole room. I mean, anybody who had any titles, anything, all the RSRs, they all had come to listen. And my wife opened the book and started reading. And their faces started getting longer and longer. And it was motion that, well, as Bob Stone put it, somebody said, he called us the vocal minority. He said the vocal minority, it changed some minds in the Board of Trustees, so they, you know, canceled the, you know, voted to not put it up for approval. Then we talked about trying to go back to the conference thing and group conscience the thing, but it was really a setup for failure. Bob was not behind it. The Lit chair's name was Vince, and he nicknamed it Vince's Horse and Pony Show. So you can tell how much support was given to that. I went to the one in Baltimore. My wife went to Chicago, and what came out of the office or World Lit was that the Chicago draft really sucked. What they did was they had 9 different workshops. They took the 9 drafts, put them together into one in Chicago, and they said, and I spoke to somebody who worked on that draft, and he said it was great. So I don't know. The way that we got it in Baltimore, it was very limited, and there wasn't a lot of time to do anything. Basically, you know, you worked for a day, you know, you came back the next day, and then you were done. And the thing that we were told was to take what you could use out of the white form and what was good out of the purple form and try to put the, you know, all we had time to do was go through the white form. Basically, there was a lot of good ideas, but what we suggested was to make them generic because they were too singular or individual. And then there was some stuff that just crossed out. So we were doing like green for good, red for no, yellow for make generic. And we just, by the time we finished all that, we were doing steps 6 and 7, we were out of time. So that's about as much as we got to input that book in there. The end product is that the office, the World Literature Committee, used what they called a staff team approach. World Lit would make notes on a page, give it to a staff writer who worked at the office. He would take their notes and rewrite, give it back to them. They'd do some more notes and send it back. And they did that, you know, chapter by chapter, and they came out with the final draft that was approved at the conference. And what we have today is the green It Works How and Why. The Just for Today book was, the Connecticut region did a lot of the writing in that and a lot of it putting it together. And I think they did a damn good job. Personally, I think that this is the most advanced piece of literature we have. That spiritually, that it's grown a lot. And one of the problems that I have today is that we're talking about editing and working on the basic text is the Greg spoke in Chicago at the World Convention in 1984. And what he said was that our literature has to change. By nature, it has to change. He said, because what I got clean on is not what you get clean on. We had something that we called book babies. And what that was somebody who walked into an NA meeting and we handed them a basic text the day they walked in. Because we didn't have that. We got clean in AA and then we, you know, got the basic text. The idea of addiction as we know today was being formulated in those literature conferences when they were going around the country. When Jim Miller went to his first Lit conference, and he was one of the guys that was really, you know, he was very literate and English and intelligent, and he was the one that noticed that the words didn't match, you know, and that we needed a language that addressed any addict. Any addict can be clean. Some addicts can be sober, not all of them. Any addict can be clean. He said that the first World Lit meeting he went into, there was 2 addicts in the whole room, and everybody else was dope fiends, and slimy dope fiends, and addict alcoholics, and clean. And it was through that process that people were coming up with addiction and NA as we know it today. And they were going home to their different places and bringing those ideas back. And of course, when they got home and tried to push these new ideas, a lot of people didn't want to hear it because they were so used to the old way. You know, they still don't, right? What was my wife got back from Georgia and had learned about addiction and surrendered to the first step truly, and when she got back and told everybody, they said, well, it was so great in Georgia, why don't you go the fuck back? Because they liked their little AANA meetings that they had, and they're, you know, during that period of time they created a group, and it was a home group whose primary purpose was to disband. Now, if you think about that, it's very strange. An NA group that's primary purpose is to disband. And what it was called was Anonymi. And you got this little blue card. And it says, a worldwide NA home group designed to provide our trusted servants whose service has sometimes isolated them from their local groups with the love and understanding they need to survive. And you were given 2 of them, one for you and one for somebody else. And my sponsor gave me that one. And what it was that when you went and learned what NA really was and the real deal, and then you went home and tried to tell people, you got beat up. But you just talked louder, and you kept talking and talking and talking. And the deal was that we would get together at conventions in different places, and we would nurture each other and say, yeah, keep going, you got it right, it's the truth, keep pushing it, it'll work. And you get filled up with spirit from this group of people. And I was driving somewhere about a year ago, and you know, I live in a town where there's, I don't know, 20 some odd NA meetings a week. They got meetings at noon every day, night every day at the clubhouse. There's 3 different places outside of that. Everybody's addicts. There's no addict alcoholics where I live, basically. And I was sitting there thinking, and I was saying, what was the name of that group? And I couldn't remember Anonymi. I couldn't remember the name, and I realized that it had disbanded because it wasn't needed anymore. Thanks for letting me share.